Hello, good evening. My name is Tatsu, and tonight we have a guest with us, and her name's Meleiza Figueroa from Green News Network. She's the executive producer. I think I hear a little feedback, but we'll take care of that. And so Mel, as she goes by, is also, in addition to being executive director of GNN, she is also the press director for the Stein Baraka campaign of 2016. She's also a PhD candidate student at the University of Berkeley in geography. So let's welcome her to our little show. So, Lisa, you're on. So would you like to say
Hello,
hi?
thank you. Hello to all the viewers. Hello, Tatsu. I'm looking forward to this.
Great. Would you like to say anything about yourself, or just go into sort of an opening statement, if you will?
Yeah, just that. Yeah, as you said, I'm the press director for the Stein Baraka campaign. I am I also am on the national committee of the Green Party. I am, executive producer of the Green News Network. And I am a grad student at UC Berkeley. I've also been an organizer in many social movements and in the communities, both in Los Angeles and in the Bay Area, for almost just about 18 to 20 years now. So I'm not only speaking from an academic background and a media background, but also an organizing background. And so, especially now at a time when the race question is kind of something that is swirling around all of our movements right now. I thought that, we would take this opportunity to actually untangle some of the, prevailing common sense, the prevailing kind of issues that are kind of at play in this question, and, how we can move forward in a way that both fosters solidarity and still, pays attention to the imperative of racial justice. As I say, the original sin of this nation was the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of African peoples. And if, until they are free, none of us are free.
Right. Well, that's great. There are, for viewers who may not be intimate with the current events that have taken place, we've seen a little bit of, shall we term it, an argumentative tone of voice and within progressive voices, and so there has been, I guess, a lot of unfortunate division, and so I try to unpack that in my own way. And I fully admit that, speaking from my own perspective, that although I'm very well versed in things like postmodernism, identity politics from the 1960s on, I don't have an intimate knowledge of, say, revolutionary movements in developing countries in the 1970s. We're talking about the decolonization of Africa, revolutionary movements in Latin America and South America and other continents, right? But I have taken the time to look at the thought leaders, the philosophers, and even some of the psychologists that still rule the public mindset today. And it's very fascinating. I haven't really come to a point of conclusion as to, and certainly not an opinion as to what is the right thing to go forward. So, some things that I've kind of scrambled down on notes here are the idea of, well, we can talk about postmodernism. I think we do have some agreement there, right, Mel, and that postmodernism is sort of a failed political philosophy, going back to Jacques Derrida.
It's ungrounded.
It's uncrafted. Is that?
It's ungrounded in experience and organizing, and I can go into the historical reasons why that is.
Okay. We have the ideas about. Well, I posited this to Mr. Ajamu Baraka himself on his last live stream for GNN, unfortunately, which was the question of equal opportunity versus equal outcome. I think some of us look to countries like democratic socialist countries such as Finland and Scandinavia as a more desirable outcome in the long run than what we have now. The question is, how do you get to that kind of place? Let's see. Well, okay, identity politics as it is now. There is the question of safe spaces. I've looked into that. We can talk about that. White privilege, and what I surprisingly, all this talk of group identity, what's the role of the individual and responsibility on a personal level, right? So these are all the things that I've been earnestly working through my own, head. And the example of Booker T. Washington versus W. Du Bois. I know that you take some of your ideas from new Marxist thought, and actually, would you care to talk about that, or is free-flowing discussion? I've just mentioned a half a dozen topics, and so
yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go into whatever you choose to go into first. I just wanted to, first, I'm not quite sure what you mean by neo-Marxism or neo-Marxism, which you have said on a previous live stream. There's a lot of various threads of Marxist thought, from the sort of official strand of the Communist International, which, has a particular trajectory. There's also the other sort of Western European Marxism, these other traditions that, come out of places like Trotsky, and then other places come out of Mao. The thread that I'm referencing here is one out of many, but it comes out of a very particular strand of thought that comes out of the experiences and the intellectualism of people of color. So people like Stuart Hall, Aimé Césaire, Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, Fernando Coronil, Edward Said. There's a whole sort of host of, decolonial and post-colonial scholarship that, actually comes from people of color in the colonized nations, and comes from the actual lived experience of decolonization and the liberation struggles of the 1950s through 1970s.
Okay.
And definitely references a much deeper tradition going all the way back to the Haitian Revolution.
Okay. So you are more, Edward Said, someone I'm somewhat familiar with. Never read a book, but, he is the proponent of
Orientalism.
Right. And, yeah.
That's got to be on the shelf.
And he comes a little after Frantz Fanon, who is probably the granddaddy of philosophers in terms of ideas. Maybe I'm using this wrongly. Ideas of black consciousness, negrigitu. I'm not sure how to pronounce that because it's only a word I've read and never pronounced. And so
it's called negritude.
Negritude. Okay. But the funny thing about Fanon is that he is directly tied to the postmodernists who were informed by Marxists from the beginning. And so what I term as neo-Marxism is, for the audience, I define Marxism original as class struggle, right? It's the Bolsheviks versus the proletariat, and so class struggle through postmodernism was transformed after the failure of communism, possibly 100 million people murdered or dying of starvation or famine or in death labor camps, ranging from, you can go back to the Great Reign of Terror in France, the Jacobins, to the Stalinist purges and the great Mao's revolution, a cultural revolution, which mopped up maybe 100 million people there, and then today North Korea. One of the books I've been looking at recently quite a lot is the Gulag Archipelago.
Can I clarify? Yeah. I'm sorry. Can I clarify something?
Sure.
So I said something in my earlier statement that there are many threads of Marxism, and the one you have referenced is a particular strand that had a particular historical articulation at a particular time, and there are to this day internecine struggles about sort of the framework of that Marxism versus others. And so when I'm just sort of, as we go along here, I want to emphasize that sort of, again, that the tradition I am referencing is a separate, it was not separate, but it is a different tradition than that which you reference here.
Okay, not a separate, but different tradition. So, okay. Well, I hear the word neo-Marxism quite a lot in reference to identity politics, the marriage of such, and so it's interesting to I've never studied this author that you posted on is it David Bodriger?
His name is David Rediger.
Rediger.
That's how you pronounce it, Rediger.
Rediger.
Yeah, and I have the book right here, so I can show our viewers. This is one of the seminal books on critical race studies that has, that's out there. It's called The Wages of Whiteness. And if you want to, if you want to start talking about this might be a good place to start, because a lot of what spurred this debate has come out of a conversation that is happening in the movements right now about the roles of white supremacy. We've heard the terms white privilege and all of this stuff coming out now, especially when we look at the authors that I have referenced to you, part of how we understand race as a social, historical, and political construction, right, is like, if we have to also understand that the notion of white only came into being with the notion of race. And sorry, excuse me. It's so because of very, very particular reasons, right?
Okay.
And I might have to go quiet him if he doesn't stop barking. Let me do that real quick, but let me, if you want to sort of start responding to this.
I'm just gonna take care of some technical things while you do that. So for people who are listening and having troubles with the Facebook stream, there is YouTube and Periscope. So I've thrown those on the screen for you now so that you can see them. So please try and tune in on YouTube /C Tatsuya-Keita1/live, and then you can also check it out on Periscope. So if that doesn't work for you, okay. So I think so. The whiteness studies is an interesting topic, and it's a relatively new area of study that I've come across in some of my research. I didn't realize some of these people are Marxist in ideology. And what the very snippet that you posted today was an attempt to circle back, full circle. If the original claim of Marxism was class warfare and ushering in utopia and destroying the culture, the society and the process, so be it. And then it goes to race and identity politics, and now this author is trying to bring it back full circle, saying that we have to actually analyze our racial injustice as the origin of class inequality itself. I mean, it seems like that's what it says. You can correct me or elaborate as you will, or what? Go ahead, because I'm not familiar.
Yeah. So that's actually, so again, what you have done is it sets up a problem, right? Race versus class, right? Race versus class. I mean, that's a lot of what's going on in the debates here in the movement, right? Are we going to talk about race and call white people out on their privilege, or are we going to, focus on the class issues that affect us all? Well, actually, what Vertiger and the social historians and actually that snippet that I posted was actually from the introduction to the new edition of the book that was written by Kathleen Cleaver, who was a female leader of the Black Panthers in the 1960s. And so what they actually try to do is say it's actually not a question of race versus class at all. And actually, this book, one of the reasons this book was written was as a corrective to a tradition of Marxist historiography and to Marxism that did say class is over race. What they used to call what race would be the second contradiction. So all we have to do is carry out the glorious proletarian revolution, and race problems will somehow fix themselves. And so, but what happened? What happened was that in the labor movement, and the labor movements of the early 20th century up to the 1930s, there was a problem with racism inside the labor movement. So the original American Federation of Labor Unions was a white union. It was a discriminating union. It was for white skilled workers, while black and brown unskilled workers were not included in that equation. But come here. So actually, this book is a history of racism within the American working class, and actually how the American proletariat specifically is shaped through the lens of race and racial division. And so what they're saying actually is a corrective is not to put race over class, or that race is, some way that class is constructed by race. Sorry, there's... come here, buddy. There's some visitors who have just come, so hold on just a moment. Buddy, come here. Hey. Come here. Sorry. So what I like to say, another quote I like to kind of pull out here is from the British activist and Stuart Hall. Come here. I'm so sorry. Hey, you're gonna go in the other room now. Then you're gonna cry. So Stuart Hall said, what he said was that race is the modality by which class is lived. If you look at this from a historical perspective, you will see that actually class and race through the modern notion of class, meaning industrial class, and race works together, and that one is inseparable from the other, not one over the other, but both of them have to be worked out in the same fashion. Sorry.
Okay, so this is
please.
Yeah.
Let me give him something to chew on. I'll be right back.
Okay. Okay, so just a question for audience participants. Is the audio okay? Are we seeing problems over there?
Okay, sorry about that. I have unruly. So.
Okay. Yep, I'm just checking the stream health, and looks okay.
Sure. Well, I mean, maybe he was too much to reiterate my point. My point was that this whole notion that race and class work together to oppress both people on the race of on the intersection of race and class, and that we have to look at it together, not one over the other or one versus the other. That's it, basically.
Well, okay, that's interesting. So, I mean, from my perspective, it's actually a little concerning because, again, Marxism's class warfare resulted in the deaths of perhaps 100 million people in prison camps and starvation.
Okay, here you go again, though. I already told you that's not the tradition that, I mean, there are lots of Marxists, just like there are lots of Christians, right? You can't, look, Catholicism killed a whole fuckload of people, right? But you're not going to blame the Amish because the Catholics killed a bunch of people, right? I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, is that you're already, I just got to call out the straw man arguments where they're called out, because straw man arguments
are,
why
again, call yourself Marxism at all?
I'm sorry?
Why call yourself Marxist at all? Why not divorce
I call myself
from
a Marxist because
from the ideology that
Marx
was
himself,
failed.
Before Stalin, before Mao, but this is what I'm trying to say. Before Marxism was an ideology, Marxism was an organizing principle, okay? And it was a method of analysis. It was a method of analysis that took history, what Marx called the profane process of history. Okay, dude. Come here. Over here. Now. Okay? What Marx called the profane process of history, meaning stuff that actually happens, things that actually happen to people, like the actual factual process of history. Then you go back and you look at how did we get here, and then it's about how do we go forward. That was what Marx himself thought. This is what he thought as he made the Communist Manifesto in 1848. In the Paris Commune of 1871, and later on. But just like, kind of like a game of telephone, like there's different generations, there's different power struggles, there's different factional interpretations that go on. And like I said, just like with Christianity, are you going to blame Jesus for the murder of millions of people? Or are you going to blame Catholics in the Roman Empire for that? Right? So you have to be very specific about what you are what you're critiquing, because the tradition that you are critiquing, that you say killed millions of people or whatever, that has a very specific history, and it's not the history that I'm referencing here. So, like I'm saying, take me at my word, take me at my interpretation, because it is an interpretation that is also shared by many people who were also killed by the regimes of Stalin and other folks. Remember, Stalin purged a hell of a lot of Marxists. I think he purged all the wrong Marxists, because they're the ones we need right now, right?
Yeah, so, I can tell you about the purges of the communists.
Marxism, not Stalin. Thanks.
Yeah, I can tell you about the purges of the communists in Soviet Russia.
I don't want to hear about them. We're not talking about that. We're talking about decolonial struggle. We can talk about Russia if you want, but that's a separate conversation. Okay?
Well,
what I want to talk about
I don't stand for
organizing.
I don't stand for a redefinition of Marxism and a narrow view that actually encompasses all the class and race trouble that the past has brought up. And we've seen, I mean, how many examples of genocide and mass murder, torture, prison camps do we need, and postmodernism.
So why don't we look at?
I mean, come
on.
Look
at the decolonial regime that aided in murder.
And you're not
the decolonial regime aided in murder.
Unfortunately, you're not the first person to say, bring about this argument that, well, that wasn't real Marxism. If we gave it another chance, and I'm someone who studied this, and it would work out. And that, I mean, what you're saying is that if I was in charge, then I'd be the one who'd bring about the utopia instead of genocide. And if you read a book like Soullessness, and you know that's not true. You know that the authoritarian nature of people led Stalin to kill. That's what they wanted. And we see elements in this in our own community, right? The refusal of certain people to talk, because that's dialogical, and they don't believe in logic. That's the neologism of.
Okay, stop.
That is the neologism that Derrida invented. Phallologic, logocentric, right? That the injustice was because of male
this. Before we get into abstractions here, can I ask before we spin off into abstractions here? Because I actually share your critique of Derrida. I share your critique of I share your critique of authoritarianism, sectarianism. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is decolonization. Okay, let's bring it back, because again, you're constructing a straw man. I don't even want to go there, because that's not what I'm arguing. I want you to stay here. I want you to stay present with me, and I want us to actually untangle what is going on. Okay?
All right. And I just want to before we go, I just want to address one last thing, and then we can move on to perhaps another topic. And again, when I'm trying to listen, as hard as I can, because I have to pay attention to the stream health of 3 different platforms at the same time, and comments as well. And nothing huge here. I think this stream is stable. So when I hear that it's not just you're taking this whole thing out of context, and Marxism can be saved, and it's just the actions of a few individuals. Well, first of all, it was not. It was a collective unconscious.
Please don't put words in my mouth. If you have a question about clarification about something that I have said, please ask it.
Sure.
And please don't assume things, because I'm finding that what happens is that it sets the frame wrong. And then I'm going to have to keep, so let's stay present on the questions at hand. Okay, so if you have a question, please ask it.
I'm merely trying to restate what your argument was before, in that Marxism, that's not Marxism, this is Marxism. You can clarify again if you want, and you don't you don't throw a whole religion under the bus because of a couple of extremists or something like this, that kind of. And what we're doing now is getting more analysis into it. And what it reminds me of, you're welcome to critique this and call it unfair if you like, but one figure I studied recently is Jeffrey Sachs, who is on the board of the Sanders Institute. He's a fellow. You're probably familiar with him, right? Do you know him?
I'm very familiar with Jeffrey Sachs.
Right, and so he's the guy. Oh wow! So he's the guy that ushered in, the shock doctrine, and his comments and his failure in Russia to save people, never mind the economy, because it went to trash. And it's interesting to hear him now, because what he believes in is that, what I've learned is that you have to localize it for the geography, and then this whole privatization shock doctrine thing works, shock therapy. And so it reminds me a little bit of that. It just let's patch this thing up, and
I'm sorry, I'm losing you. What did you of that?
I'm sorry?
I lost your argument when you said that reminded me of this. Can you say what the that is again?
So Jeffrey Sachs's analysis of his own work, why he had beginner's luck, and say, Bolivia, and then while he failed tremendously in a country like Russia, where overnight people were selling their collective shares in private companies as food in the streets, and thus crashing the economy and ruining whatever shares people had in industry. What he said was, well, and there's these like long, medium interviews with him. I forget who it was, and it says, well, no, I don't believe. First of all, he tries to distance himself on his own blog, and then he says, yeah, the original foundation is strong, but what we didn't take into account was geography and local cultural things of that nature. And so this whole what I call neo-Marxist, you may call them something else. I don't buy it.
I still don't buy that.
I don't agree with the analysis that Marxism. I mean, just divorce yourself from Marxism if you think the past was that bad and you're not disagreeing with me. Why not just call it something else? Because
I'm not going to let them take Marx. Like I told you, some of my heroes were killed by Stalin. I think Stalin messed up the greatest chance that we ever had to defeat fascism in the 1920s. That's why I'm doing the movement schools as we speak. Movement Schools Revolutionaries is another project that I'm engaged in to actually revive what many Marxists were engaged in, which was called the United Front Against Fascism. What happened in the 1920s was that Lenin died, and then Stalin took power. He kicked out Trotsky and Gramsci and he killed a bunch of people, and he threw that plan in the bin. Like I said, there are many strands of Marxism. It was a revolutionary movement that took over countries in like the 20th century. There were many different factions. There were many different power struggles, but there were people who were interested in the genuine question of how do regular people achieve economic and political democracy. That core question to me is a question that Marxists and Marx himself asked, and I still think that's a valid question. Again, I do not consider myself in the tradition of Stalin. I consider myself in the tradition of many people who organized, struggled with themselves, with their movements, with their people, and with oppressive governments on this particular question. How do the people, the ordinary people, the workers, the peasants, how do we throw off the chains of oppression? How do we achieve economic and political democracy? That is a question that I think not just Marxists are taking on, but a lot of other folks too. And again, a lot of the people, there's a lot of stakes to that question because there's a lot of power, right, that is infused in the ability to organize politically and the ability to take power and organize a revolution, right? And so there were a lot of people with a lot of different ideas about how to go about things. And some people got into a lot of fights. Some people died, right?
Hundreds of millions.
Wait. Some people were butchers that did, engage in genocide. Yes. But, okay,
yes,
again, let us hold that intention with the historical things of all the other folks who were actually invested in the question of economic and political democracy. That's the tradition I'm working in. I have no problem with you bashing on genocide people and dictators, but that's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about active struggles that come from the people and a tradition that comes from that yes calls itself Marxist because again, Marxism is not just an ideology. It is a method of analysis, and it is it's a question that people hold in their hearts. How do we get to
saying
economic
Marxism
and political
is not
democracy?
an ideology?
People have real whack ideas about how to get there, And some people
claiming it's not
use
an
a lot of
ideology?
stuff themselves. That's like what politics, right?
I'm sorry. Are you claiming that?
I'm sorry.
Are you claiming that Marxism is not an ideology?
I am claiming that there is an ideology called Marxism. There are very specific code words or like things that people call Marxism that do represent an ideology in the form of a scripture. But there are also other people who will take things that Marx said, things that particular ways that he parsed apart history and economic and social systems and said, hey, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. This actually still works in terms of looking at capitalist development, looking at power relations, looking at sort of the historical conditions of struggle. And as Marx himself said, it has to be rooted. When he said that he turns Hegel on his head, it's because it is rooted in the real conditions of people, the lived experience. And this is what we want to get to. And if we want to move to the issue of how do we treat supremacy in terms of sort of the ability to define our world and to be able to, again, oppress people by sort of modifying or constructing realities such as race, we can get into that because it's a really, really interesting question and a very salient one for the discussions that we're in right now with our movements. So I'd like to see if we can just park this question of which Marxism and actually go into the ideas themselves and how they sort of affect people, how they've affected struggle, and what the elements we can take from it to kind of look at the dilemmas that we face now in our movement. Can we do that?
Okay, here's what I believe about Marxism. That, yes, it is an ideology, and here's what I believe about current society. That we live in a post-ideological time frame. Go ahead and
say what you say about smokable here, okay?
Okay. So, I believe that we live in a post-ideological society. That even the most, shall we say, typical Trump voter understands that there is no such thing as truth in political theater. When Trump says that he didn't grab someone's pussy, that he or she knows that Trump is lying, and that is the great failure of Hillary Clinton to not get in on the joke. And so we know this world is not real. We know that all ideologies are fake. And furthermore, we know that rigid ideologies lead to authoritarianism. And the failure of Marxism from the very beginning is the failure to recognize the transcendent. And why is Marxism called the utopia that never was and ended up in genocide time and time again, is because it's like John Milton analyzing Adam and Eve and Paradise Lost, and the devil's failure, Satan's failure, his sin, as it were, was to stand up to God and say, I know everything there is to know, and I don't need you. And so, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And so that is evil, as analyzed by someone like Milton. And Marxism is guilty of the same thing. The state, ushering in the utopia, individuals giving up everything for the state. And let's not forget that Marxism, one of the great crimes against the state in Soviet Russia, or all Marxist communist countries, is to practice religion, because that's transcendent. That's outside of the state. One of the crimes against the state is to be happy, and one of the and it gets random, right? Communist Party members being rounded up, and they're despondent and broken because they were loyal party members. And you read books like The Gulag Archipelago, a book that Chris Hedges tells us to read time and time again. And you read the story of a letter from a communist member who's in the gulags and receives reading her 16-year-old daughter's letter to her. Mommy, are you guilty of being a criminal against the state? If you're not, then I will not join the Communist Youth Party. I will defy them. But if you are guilty, then I will. And of course she's not guilty. The woman, the adult, the mother, she writes back, I am guilty. Please join the Communist Party. And so the ideology goes so deep and pervasive. And what Solzhenitsyn recognized is that there's evil in all of us. And what Marxism brings out is this, either nihilism or authoritarianism. And most people, given the chance, given the power, the opportunity, will rat out their brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, and send everyone to jail. And so I would never call myself a Marxist. And that's what I believe. I believe in speaking of color and what it means to uplift the community of African American concern. This is one of the books I read in high school, and The Souls of Black Folk by W. Du Bois.
Can you hold it up a little closer? We only could see the corner of it. Hold it to your other computer.
Oh, I'm sorry. So
The Souls of Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So I have two cameras. You're on the webcam, and the viewers are seeing me from the external. Sorry.
Just want to make sure. Okay. No problem.
And so I think I did talk about this before. So as you know, Du Bois was a contemporary of Booker T. Washington and somewhat of Marcus Garvey. So these are three very prominent figures in the post-slavery era, someone after, the time period of someone like Frederick Douglass, right, an abolitionist during the time of slavery. And so these, the talented tenth of Du Bois versus the education system of Booker T. Washington. And time's a terrible judge as to who was the better man. And I suggest Washington because Du Bois ended up a communist. He spent years with Mao, and he promoted a sort of elitist, the talented tenth, right? And so there were select few wise men within the African community who knew what was best. And so after sort of theorizing that the struggle for African American liberation was tied up and bound through blacks across the world, he left the U.S., was a guest of Mao, and eventually made his way to Ghana, where he died with President Kwame Nkrumah, right? And so that's his legacy. And Booker T. Washington started Tuskegee University. You see his name on middle schools and elementary schools all across America, named in his honor, because he had the audacity to make a deal, a devil's deal. And this is what they bitterly fought about, the Atlanta Compromise, as it was called. And so Booker T. Washington agreed with the white political machine that he would not, and they would not, his caucus, if you will, challenge the power and dominance of these white political establishment figures. And in exchange, Washington and his cohorts would be allowed to uplift and educate African Americans. And so this sort of view of uplifting the individual is not present in Marxism. And so it's a very instructive.
Okay, hold on. We'll get into that. Let's get into that.
Sure.
But go ahead, finish your story.
Okay. And so you have the story of the two most famous African American thinkers in the post-emancipation prior to 1965 era. And one was a Marxist and a communist, an avowed communist, and one was just checking the battery power. Very good. And one sought to lift the individual, right? And so, yeah, I'm a fan of Washington and not so much of Du Bois. And, so there's there's all kind of things wrong with Marxism, but we can move on to okay. I should just give you a chance to talk. So
maybe what we should do here is talk about. So we can talk about Du Bois, who I think actually talked extensively about individual consciousness, especially, his notion of double consciousness was something that actually helped me through the time at university because, I'm a working class person of color. I get into the big university at age 28 with, all of these very entitled folks around, and it's almost like they spoke a different language. It's almost like I didn't grow up around these people. My folks went to college, but they went to college in the Philippines. They didn't go to college here. So I had no kind of support system for actually helping me navigate the college system. I had a lot of it was a very different experience for me than the experience that I had community college and, being very downward mobile as a teenager. So, I'm trying to navigate this world that in many ways has a lot of norms and a lot of kind of assumptions and rules of behavior and why don't you just get a credit card? These kinds of things that were unfamiliar to me. And so, when W.E. Du Bois talks about the notion of double consciousness, it is about it's about navigating both worlds. It's about, knowing that because, I was hella out of my comfort zone. And, I live in a world in which there really is not very much of a comfort zone for me. I have been able to win some comfort zone for myself because of intellectual work and advancing in school. But what double consciousness means is that you come from a certain place, you come from a certain lived experience and a certain identity, and you are also in a world that is completely unconscious of you. This is kind of the point when we talk about this is how I and the thinkers that I hold dear and that who have taught me want to talk about sort of the issues of how race and class work together. I brought a prop, so I kind of want to use it here. So look at this. This is a system of white supremacy, right? This is a system. It is a system that has been constructed over. Is this working in the live stream? I know my.
It's on. It's good.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a system that has been constructed over decades with the economic and political power of colonialists, of European, of all different kinds, because this is before white existed, right? And also deconstruction of whiteness. And the way that we want to use whiteness here is that whiteness is not necessarily your bloodline or where you came from or whether your grandmother was a Cherokee princess or whatever, right? Race here as white is defined as kind of like the in club, right? You can fit up in here because your sort of experiences, your norms, your language is kind of like shaped by the system. Now, there are different people of color, colonized peoples, and remember, when Fanon talked about colonialism, he meant that colonization is not just of territory and of people, but of your very minds. It's the enslavement of the mind as well. And so these people have experiences that these folks don't have who are totally inside the system. And so these over here, now Fernando Coronil talked about the way that the system discounts, right, and dehumanizes the people that they're exploiting is through 4 types of representational practice. One, it basically separates them out, so things like racial, skin color, nationality, etc. They created these others, these communities. Number 2, they took away their history. Part of the experience of colonialism is that your culture and your history is erased. Number 3, it turns difference into hierarchy. Now, this is where we can get into what I do critique about identity politics, which is called oppression Olympics, right? It's turning people against each other, saying, "Oh, I'm more oppressed than you," etc., because it is still sort of replicating that colonial mindset of separation. Number 4, that's exactly what they did, was naturalize these representations. And number 5, intervene, however unwittingly or wittingly, in the reproduction of colonial power relations. You want to talk about Ghana? There is an excellent documentary by Adam Curtis called The Trap, in which he goes into the experience of Kwame Nkrumah and his attempt to modernize
I've
Ghana.
watched it. I've watched it.
To actually how Europeans went, and European interference also kind of contributed to that decline. But let's not get into that. What I want to get into is how does this system of white supremacy, this system by which race and class are constructed, right, for the benefit of the 1%, how are we able to stand up for our brothers and sisters who are out here? How are we going to be an ally to them? How are we going to fight for a world that actually includes them? All right? So there's one way to do it, which is what I think a lot of folks are arguing, which is, you have to appeal to the people. You have to, make sure that white people understand you, that they're comfortable, which means we're asking them to kind of bend themselves to fit into the system of white supremacy in order to appeal on the terms of class. Now, this is what Marxists try to do, and this is where there is a strand of Marxists that critique Marxists on this, that they actually tried to say class is over race, so you got to put your race aside for a minute and actually, unite with the working class. Well, that didn't work because, again, these experiences have been erased by colonialism. Now, what I think we should do as a decolonizing, and what a lot of Fanon and all of these thinkers kind of said is that in order to rectify this, we have to expand our systems. We have to expand our culture, our organizing culture, and our systems and our very thought to include the experiences of the people who have been marginalized by the system. That's literally what the margin set means. But this isn't enough. What Fanon says is that we have to, once we expand this and we fully integrate these other cultures and these other peoples as equal citizens and equal human beings, we can get rid of the system of white supremacy together and have a decolonized system. Okay? This is where race and class go together. Because, again, it's not up to us. This is why a lot of people of color talk about the amount of labor they have to do to, it's our job to go and tell and kind of kiss ass to white people to make them support us. No. What a lot of these decolonization scholars are trying to say is no, it's the other way around. It is the privileged who must come out of their comfort zone, who must understand and integrate the experiences of marginalized people into their own worldview and expand it. What all of this sectarianism, including the Marxists and the Marxisms that you interpret, all the problem that stems from so much of this is because our worldview is too small to incorporate the real experiences of people. And so what I'm trying to say, what decolonization is, what decolonizing your mind is to expand it. All right? So I just wanted to get that out there because I wanted you to lay the ground for what, like, I hadn't even explained yet what it is my position is. Now I have. Now we can talk on an equal ground because now you know where I'm coming from. And you don't have to, like, assume things about Marxism or any of this other stuff. Okay? All that is separate. I want you to engage with this idea that I have right now in front of me. Okay?
All right. So you started off with the idea that the world is unconscious about you instead of the reverse, and that's interesting because I think we had an offline or online conversation about rationality, and if you listen to the psychodynamic theorists or psychoanalysts of Jungian or Freudian or even Nietzsche, who was an existentialist, they believe that your rationality is bounded by several things. It's bounded by, first of all, the world around you, and then it's bounded by your body, because your body, without a body, you cannot think, and so and your experiences and your emotions and your motivations, and inside of that very small circumscribed space is your rationality. And so that's who we are as individuals. And now you say that the world is unconscious about the individual. And am I correct? Did I restate your words?
Well, I'm saying that the world is unconscious. The system as it is constructed, the system that distributes resources and confers political power on people. Okay, this historically constructed system does not account for the experiences of marginalized people. Why? Because it could not account for the experiences of marginalized people, because once people start seeing slaves as real people, stuff is going to happen. Ooh, they're going to realize that actually it's the rich people that is exploiting all of us. That's exactly what happened with Bacon's Rebellion in the 1600s. With Bacon's Rebellion, and this is where actually the notion of race comes into play for the first time. Because before, there was no white, there was Irish, Scottish, English, French, Saxony, whatever So,
okay,
when Bacon's
racism
Rebellion,
didn't get invented with Bacon's Rebellion.
The elite. Let me talk about Bacon's Rebellion because it's very, very crucial in the historical construction of race. So the elite started getting nervous that poor Europeans and indentured servants were teaming up with black slaves. They were teaming up with indigenous people. They were teaming up with rogue Europeans from the French and stuff, and they were going to rise up against the masters. And so what the elites decided to do.
Sounds like a class struggle. But, yeah.
Bunch of these, yeah. So, coming from the class struggle, because they realized that they couldn't have all these people united, they started to give the poor white Europeans things like jobs, things like slave catching. You can be part of the police, right? Gave them jobs like being the overseers. Started giving them people and on the basis of appearance and nationality, started giving them sort of benefits. And also, at the same time, if you read Thomas Jefferson, he did say in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, but he had this whole other thing on what he called the Negro question, where it's well, what does it mean? Because, black people really aren't people. So they had, when you have a democracy and you're trying to create equal rights for all, but not the people that you're enslaving, right? Then there's a certain set of ways you have to represent those people in order to justify their separation and enslavement, right? And so that's where this notion of race actually starts to get constructed. White people and white privilege, there's whites all over the place. Scottish, Irish, actually, if like white people actually did go into
color of
their
skin has been the
heritage, which is
basis of race slavery since the beginning of civilization.
They call it
I don't understand how it
right?
starts with bacon. Since Mesopotamia, I mean, you have different skin
Actually,
colors
no.
being the basis
Let
of
me-
who,
Nope,
who's the slave, right?
Slavery is not the same in Mesopotamia the way it is in the United States. In Mesopotamia, the old world slave systems that existed up until, let me see if I can share this, up until the point of colonization, right? I'm going to try to share this screen with you all so you can see the slide that I made. So this is the African slave trade. And up until the point of colonization, slavery in the African kingdoms followed what was called Old World slavery. Old World slavery was that somebody who was taken as a slave was a product of war. It was like a war spoil. It was, they had avenues to their freedom, to buy their freedom or to trade for their freedom in order, like with a favor for a master. And number three, they were often adopted into their, the society after they had bought their freedom. So Old World slavery was a very particular thing. The notion of chattel slavery in North America in the New World was a very new thing. It was a new form of slavery. It was a new form of slavery that actually treated people as actual property, like things. It was that a whole layer of people from an entire continent got ripped out of their continent, plunked onto another continent, and given no rights as a human being. That was historically different from all of the old world slaveries that had gone before. It was literally the commodification of labor. It made people into things that had never happened before in the history of slave systems. Okay?
I don't understand. What's the difference? Freud would call this the narcissism of minor differences. I mean, what is the difference between
no, it's not.
Viewing someone as property or slave labor or slave labor? Yes.
No, I'm not saying this is not the minor differences, because minor differences. Look, the Electoral College exists because of this minor difference, because of the legal representation of African slaves is 3/5 of a person. Okay, there is an actual material consequence to this when we talk about blood quantum for Native Americans. There's an actual material and political and economic consequence to the difference of treating one entire layer of people as not as human as other people. This is completely different. This is why it is qualitatively different, right? And it is the historical practice of 500 years of denying the humanity of other people, okay? Because, of course, look, genocides and stuff, war is different in this period. With World War I, World War II, mechanized industrial killing, right? Carpet bombs, drones, what we see now. Like, I'm saying that when you talk about what a difference is, there's a philosophical difference, and then there's a difference that has consequences in the real world. This is where, again, I heard people on that preview, they wanted to see us take it down to the concrete. We wanted to take it down because
I disagree with your analysis that this is a brand new form of slavery. Gerard over here is talking about the Arab slave trade, and before Europeans started slavering in blacks, Africans, to America, the Arabs traded Asians, Europeans, and Africans. Okay, and so
yes, they did. Asians and Europeans path to freedom.
And so we have, we see the same form of oppression. Oppression is oppression. If you don't have your freedoms, you're a wage prisoner. Like, working on a plantation, working in Africa, or in the Middle East, it doesn't matter. You're a slave. So I don't
matter actually, because you said
you're just wanting to tie the most recent widely known form of slavery as consequentially different. It is consequentially different to us because we're the direct result of that. But no, this has gone on all the time, and there's this concept of the Pareto principle, and this is where the conversation. I don't think we're going to finish this tonight, but where the conversation should end up is discussing the hard realities of history. And the hard realities of history. Well, I think it's about my time to talk. I think it's about my time to talk.
No, I just need to go. I need to just vacate for a second. There's somebody at the door. Please hold on.
Oh. How are we doing, everyone? I'm going to check the time. Wow. An hour 20. So we're.
I'm sorry, this is not my house. So there were like guests that came, and so.
Right, and so, yeah, Mela's not exactly at home. She lives in Northern California, where Kaiser Permanente is headquartered.
Actually, I'm not in Oakland right now.
Right, you're not, but you
okay.
You go to school in Berkeley, and so she's in Humboldt, as it were. And Kaiser Permanente is interesting because that's the headquarters of the company, which also another spinoff of Kaiser Permanente, the first HMO in America, worth billions of dollars and covers millions of people, is also part of Kaiser Industries, which is Kaiser Aluminum. As you know from the movie Black Power by Adam Curtis, is what brought forth Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah's dream of an electrified Gold Coast into being. And the unfortunate failure of him to deliver that in time to save his legacy partially led to his coup. And so while we talk about colonial struggles, and we haven't gotten to imperialism as it was in the 1960s and how it stands today, and let's not forget that my original position was that in the end the elites care not about racism. Why should they care when they can enslave us all? And that's an idea I still stand by.
That's the point, that their techniques of enslaving people get applied to different folks.
And
that's the point.
Right, and all of the African countries failed, right, and all the post-colonial struggles to form nation states did succeed. They are independent nations, but they are still exploited. And why are they still exploited? That's the interesting question. I shouldn't say it like that because it sounds purely intellectually curious and uncaring, and that's not true. I do have motivations and emotions around that, but I don't think that's what gets you to a solution. And so the you describe this system of white. First of all, I'd like to define exactly what is systematic white supremacism, as you pulled up on a diagram, and that's a very vague thing. Systematic racism, very bandied about term. Systematic, for me, is legal. The institution of law, and as far as I know, that was addressed in 1965 with the Civil Rights Act, and so on a legal institutional basis, theoretically speaking, all races are equal under the law. That's not the borne out experience, of course. We do, and we do see violence, and disproportionately so for certain minorities and others. But we fail to recognize that life itself is suffering. And I spoke before about the failure of Marxism to recognize the transcendent, to even legitimize that at all, and actually delegitimizing it so much so that it is a penalty, crime against the state.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by the transcendent? I'm trying to follow your argument, so what do you mean by the transcendent?
The transcendent is a generic term for anything, whatever makes you feel good. I mean, if it's religion, if it's Freud's idea of the id,
your emotions, basically your affect, right? Is that what you're trying to say?
Whatever helps you deal with the question of how do I get through life?
Yeah.
Because it is suffering, right?
Yep.
You're born into suffering. You're born as a helpless, vulnerable infant, and you're expanding your lungs, crying your lungs out, and seeking help unconsciously so, without even recognizing your own being. And it just gets worse from there on out. So the transcendent is what you do or what you believe in that makes you a better person, that helps you overcome your suffering, and makes you possibly be the tool for helping the world, right? Helping something else beside your own suffering. Now, if you can transcend that, then maybe you can go on to your family, maybe you can help your friends, maybe you can help people in this movement, and then maybe, just maybe, you can be that golden tool. And it takes a lot of work to get there, right? As you know. And so that's what I mean by the transcendent. It's really just a generic term, and it's not a specifically religious term. It's also that's what religion, cross-culturally speaking, whether you're talking about Buddhism, Christianity, or other faiths, that's what they deal with, right? Suffering. How do we get past that? And so that's what the utopia defies. It says we can have the utopia without the transcendent. And if we just try this once again, we'll get there. And if we try with a different leader, maybe someone who's not a homicidal, genocidal maniac like 99% of the people, and I'm talking about all of us, because the chances are that you are that angel who is morally superior and completely immune to power and what it does to people, and is almost zero. And even if you were, someone would be right behind you and shoot you in the back of the head if you tried. So that's Marxism. And so when we talk about the post-colonial struggle in Africa and nation, you defined it as it's the fault of neoliberalism, and you didn't say that. You said it was Western intervention, and it's true and not true. It's actually both true that Kwame Nkrumah failed on his own merit, and that he was toppled by the CIA. It's both true, and actually, from from the very cursory overview I've gone through country after country, we can talk about. I'll just rattle off some names here. We can't talk about Meleiza from Ethiopia, the last emperor of
Can we
Ethiopia.
just focus on one? Sorry, Tatsu.
Nasser,
I'd like to
Biko,
maybe...
Sikatori, Samora Michelle, Sankara, and others. A lot of the problem actually goes back to us, right? Our desire,
Yeah.
In every single cell phone that we buy, we're exploiting the Congo, right? Because there's a mineral in here, as you probably know, called columbite tantalite, and it's an essential component, a trace mineral that is in the capacitors that powers these things up, and so our desire for consumer goods and cell phones and PlayStations and all of this is what drives the exploitation of Africa, especially in the Congo, where the Congo is a particularly rich, minerally speaking, country, where it has a lot of copper. The uranium used in the atom bombs against Japan was mined in the Congo, and so it's always been this exploitation. And to go back to Lenin, he defined imperialism as economic territories, not physical territories. That's speaking of Lenin, and so that's what it's about. It's about control, not physical control. That's colonialism, right? Imperialism is when we want their resources or whatever for economic gain. And so that's where
They're both that way, by the way. They were both about economic gain. Gold and silver mined out of Potosi mines in Peru was about currency.
Right. But, Africa, those nations are sovereign states, right? And I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the problem, and this goes true for Ghana, is corruption. You saw that in the movie, right? That the foreign nationals would come in, the foreign business people would come in, and they found it easier just to bribe the local officials to get their way, to grease the wheels, and and over 5 years, Ghana's bankrupt because all these little petty government officials have given their money away to Western businessmen, and thus he couldn't. He made a Faustian bargain with Kaiser Aluminum in your backyard to build the Akasumbo Dam, the Volta River project, the dam that would deliver electricity for all of Ghana and then usher them into the age of industrialization. Ghana had to put 50% in, but they only got 20% of the electricity. And why? Because he was forced to.
I'm so sorry, Tatsu. We are on way longer than I had anticipated, and there are now guests in the house. It's going to make this a little difficult. So, shush.
Okay. Look, do you want to
put a lot out on the table? You put a lot out on the table, and you kind of, I see, the kind of stream of consciousness. Like but I kind of want to try to rein it back in because I came on here because I want to and people should. We can give a link to the Adam Curtis documentary. I think it's an excellent documentary. So is his documentary, The Century of the Self, which we hadn't gone into it, but it talks a lot about sort of the individualism, the particular neoliberal individualism that gets cultivated through sort of the movements of the 60s and why it becomes problematic once left movements are trying to actually get stuff done, and the individualism. It also does, and I would really encourage reading Frantz Fanon on a lot of the stuff that you talk about when you talk about the transcendence and the role of affect. This is actually where the decolonization scholars, they really do split off from the economic Marxists in a very, very in a very major way in a very crucial period in the 60s because, the whole point of the experience of decolonizing is trauma. And Stuart Hall, who was a Caribbean scholar who was at the Open University in the UK. These are all citations I want to throw out to people because, it's for people to read more and get educated, and learn about these people. So Hall said that, basically there's a traumatic character to the colonial experience. The ways in which Black people, Black experiences, he's talking about that specifically, but I would also think about it in terms of indigenous people on our continent here in North America and all over the world, the ways in which these experiences were positioned and subjected in the dominant regimes of representation were the effects of a critical exercise of power and normalization. The erasure of history that I talked about that creates a world like this, where the experiences of so many of us are sort of hanging on the outside. This does create an affect. This does affect people of color's ability to get up and go to work in the morning and get in their cars and hope that they're not going to get pulled over by a cop. Or, look, I'm Asian, but I'm dark skinned. So sometimes during the summer, I go in and I'm watched in stores and I'm treated like a dirty Mexican, right? But I'm lucky because I can code switch, But this is very real for people every single day. Like you said, the legal systems of, slavery and the 3/5 are, for the most part over and done with. Why do we still have the Electoral College, right? This is not all over, right? But the persistence of the norms and the assumptions and what we call the common sense of a completely different exploited class that looks different from us. Those representations persist. And that is precisely why, when people of color ask for spaces, when they ask for, they're asking for their room. They're asking for room to be able to speak to their own realities. And so, yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable because it's not what we're used to. But we have to reckon with the fact that these exist because these are here, whether or not we want them to be, whether or not we think they are. They're still going to be here, and they're still going to affect daily life for a hell of a lot of people. And this is not also to say, right? This is not also to say that this is any better or any different from what white people are talking about. Again, the ultimate goal we want to get to is a place in which all lives do matter, right? Well, all lives should matter. All lives should matter, including Black lives, right? But to get to this system where all lives exist in an equal basis and with an equal playing ground. Now this, right, to get here is what we then called, it is what Frantz Fanon talked about. Now it's very interesting. Again, this is where he departs from, right, the Marxists. This is where he departs from, right, the super economic folks that didn't talk about affect. I share that criticism of yours, right? But here come people. But then it takes people like any tradition of thought, like any intellectual history. It takes new people to come in and say, hey, there's a gap here, but I still think that there's some truth to this, so we're going to reform it. We're going to add to it. We're going to call it something else. And if you want to call it not Marxism, but call it decolonization, we can do that too. I think there's still an importance in calling it Marxism, but what we want to focus on is, again, the whole reason we're having this debate is how do we use it in our daily lives now? How do we organize in terms of it? So here's Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. It's one of my favorite books in the entire world. When they talk about Fahrenheit 451, what book are you going to memorize? This is the book I would memorize. Because, again, Fanon was a psychiatrist from Martinique, and he worked in Algeria during the Algerian War, in which the French had colonized Algeria, and there was a war for liberation. He talked about what is the point of nationalism in a continent where nations basically came from lines that Europeans drew arbitrarily and doesn't really match up with like sort of the social life of people. But he's saying, well, colonialism did change the social life of people. It changed them because it differentiated them into classes. It separated urban and rural. It separated out the intellectuals from the workers and the peasants from the industrial like workers. So he's looking at what's actually going on in Algeria. What are the class formations around the colonized? Where do they differ? Where are they turned against each other? And where can they find common ground, right? And that, again, there's something very specific to the experience of colonization that kind of destroys that affect sense that you're talking about. It destroys that transcendence, or it fragments it, because, again, part of keeping people down is keeping people down psychologically and keeping people down culturally by telling them every day that they're not worth living, that they're trash, right? That they can walk down the street, be playing with a toy, and get shot by a cop, right? That's trauma. That is everyday trauma that people, I had the experience recently, of suffering from PTSD and being and having to deal with the fear every day. Mm-hmm. It's a real thing, right? And how do we survive that? Just so like you're saying, how do we find that transcendence? How do we find it together, right? And so again, what I'm saying is not necessarily keep people comfortable, but we have to figure out where the floor is. We have to raise the floor. We have to raise or raise the basic level of solidarity into a system. Wait for it. Let me not share the screen. Into a system where we can incorporate these folks. And people like me, I live in this sort of liminal space over here, right? Where we can take into account my trauma, where we can take into account Black women's trauma, Black trans people's trauma. We don't leave no one behind. How do we make a system out of a system that was literally designed to leave people behind and leave people out? That's the very vital question in front of us. And it's a question, it's an applied question right now. It's an applied question for our movements, right? So I'd love to hear you speak to this, especially because you and I have been sort of, involved in the various debates around sort of the ways in which white supremacy operates in our movements. So why don't we end with that? And let's give it like 10 minutes or so, or because, again, there are guests here. This has gone on longer than I thought it was going to go, so I do have to pick up in a minute.
Well, yeah, we can obviously pick this up anytime we like to, and so, all right. So, for a couple of things. So, you talked about safe spaces. You also talked about recognizing group identity struggle and equating the struggles of Fanon to the struggles of people of today. And again, very much so like the struggles of someone striving to improve their own life, whether they be African American, let's say, or some other identity, or no identity at all. Because what is the negation of a subgroup? Is it white? I mean, I don't know. Is it straight male? The fractionality of infinite of identity politics, as it regresses infinitely, it becomes the individual, right? So identity politics is a loose game. I talked yesterday about how the L and the G's used to be against the B's, back in the day when I was reading books like AIDS demographics or AIDS cultural analysis, and studying the history of the ACT UP movement in New York City, famous for the very graphic posters depicting Reagan and the Archbishop of New York and their denial of the AIDS epidemic. And so they, So bis weren't accepted. There was a time when bis were not accepted. They were out of the normative, right? And so L's in the beginning, there was L's and G's, and they said, we're oppressed. And then bis said, oh, we're oppressed too. And then somebody else said we're oppressed, and then somebody else said they're oppressed, and then and so on and so on and so on and so on. And what we get to is the individual. And so I see a illogical incoherency in what you present, because you want to fractionate everyone down to the level of individual, but you still want to talk about identity politics and groups and speaking of and safe spaces. And speaking of safe spaces, I did a little reading on that too.
For the safe spaces, because it's kind of two different things. What you made was a very important point, and I actually agree with you on some level. So I'd like to hold that. I don't know if you want to do that, and then we can talk about safe spaces. Would that work?
Sure. So
I don't want to lose this point that you made, which is actually a very important point. And another documentary by Adam Curtis called "The Century of the Self."
Mm-hmm. I've watched it.
Excellent documentary about that. But I did publish an essay on my Facebook page that actually talked about identity politics as separate from this particular sort of fractionalized, ultra-individualized identity politics that I term identity neoliberalism. This is what I mean by this versus this, okay? So, identity neoliberal. So, if you look at, again, the separation, and you said like the endless fractionalization, that's precisely one of the colonial tools that Fernando Coronel talked about, the one that I mentioned before, where it said you separate the components of the world into bounded units, and you take away their history, and you turn difference into hierarchy. Okay, so then the I'm oppressed versus you're oppressed or whatever, like, I don't agree with that either. It's what I call oppression Olympics. It doesn't get anywhere because it is highly individualistic in that, it's, and it can be used by people to self-promote, like that's real, and it can be also sort of misunderstood in ways that are not productive to movement, right? And so that's these cries of anguish, you can't, that they exist, right? And you have to take account of them. But the more that you keep them individualized, disaggregated, fractionalized, like you said, I agree with you there. I think that there is a part, and we can, like I said, I have a whole set of slides on this too, about how neoliberalism as the system that also kind of atomizes people, right? That's how it also works to keep people divided. What I'm talking about is a politics of solidarity. When you make the floor, right, and you say, wait a minute, there are a bunch of people who are oppressed, who have different experiences of oppression. Let's not even get into comparing what and what and what, but let's actually take apart, why are they different? How do they affect people's real lives? And how do we expand our worldview, our way of thinking, our social systems, our social policies, and our compassion to be able to integrate the experiences of everybody and also make it part of a nation, make it part of a whole society. The last quote that I had from Fanon, which is actually my favorite quote in the entire world, is, let me get to it here, is at the bottom here, in his revolutionary vision of the post-colonial nation, he says, out of these struggles, out of the struggle to kind of take into account people's experiences, it's about forging a collective identity altogether that is sort of better and improved, new and improved, rebooted, different. He says, the living expression of the nation is the collective consciousness in motion of the entire people. It is the enlightened and coherent praxis of men and women. The collective forging of a destiny implies undertaking responsibility on a truly historical scale. Now look at this. He didn't imagine a utopia. He didn't make some kind of picture out of thin air as to what that actually looked like. He had no mechanical schemes of how economics or anything would work because he knew. He saw the same stuff that you did. He saw all of those millions of people die. And he was like, well, we don't want that either, right? But what he gave us was a way to move forward together. It gave us a definition and a property of solidarity with which we can actually see that our struggles are not just an additive property to somebody else's oppression, but that I cannot end my oppression unless I end your oppression, unless I end their oppression, unless I end Black and Indigenous oppression, right? And so, like I said, these things that are being used to divide us and are being sort of utilized by people, that should actually be the basis of our solidarity. And in recognizing, and what I say, like, the people who have consistently been pushed to the side, the people whose experiences have been denied, to say, hey, it's uncomfortable, that's when we say, no, we call it all in. We call it all in because we all need every one of us together.
I don't
have solidarity with another race.
Yeah, I'm not against solidarity. I just disagree with your analysis and the what
I will provide citation of if you want to look into it further.
you can citate Fanon or Fanon all you like, but all right. First of all, let's talk about American slavery and this idea of white supremacy or even today white privilege. First of all, I would like to for both of us to sort of discredit and separate or disavow, disentangle ourselves with people such as I don't know, these ideas of distributive justice and it's technically impossible.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, this is an idea of the only other person I've had a discourse with is Jessica Gonzalez, and she, I jokingly suggested, oh, maybe you should have an oppression court, and she said, oh, that's a great idea. So
I don't know what distributive justice means, so
it's her own ideology, and she made it up, and she
I do critique.
So she has this fantasy that she is the judge of oppression, and she is the one who can technically tabulate all the oppression for everybody, right? Okay, you're black. You have 2 children.
Yeah.
One's kind of smart. One's kind of not so smart. You're divorced, or actually, no, you're married. But, you're married, but your husband's a drug addict, and you're an immigrant too. So this is the price that I'm willing to pay for your oppression because of my white guilt, and that really sucks because that's we have this talk about neoliberal. We have a free market solution to oppression, but that's what she's going to run with and run for president.
Okay,
and let's not forget, who's whitey here. I mean, back in the day, most white people did not own slaves. Okay, just a few plantation owners, and
it's not
the average.
The point.
It's not the point. Well, it's the point now because every white person has white privilege as a result, and white privilege has been redefined, fundamentally redefined from its original concept that white privilege was for poor white people who were willing to be bribed by the plantation owners to keep continuing the oppression of African Americans. And somehow it's been co-opted by the identity politics, social justice warriors as a collective crime against all white people. And that's racist in itself. And so I don't agree with that. I don't agree with white privilege as a concept. I agree that in certain social circumstances you might have some sort of weight or cultural signifier, and what unfortunately I think what we're really dealing with is a certain people's powerlessness. Because I don't agree that certain people like Noah or Jessica or Jacqueline Lukeman speak for African Americans. I don't feel that their point of view is popular with and to say that they speak for all African Americans is obviously ridiculous. Anyway, and so I don't agree with the concepts of every white person has white privilege, and it's racist, right? I mean, come on. Just because of the skin color, you are guilty of collective crime against another race? I don't agree with that. And okay, so I wanted to ask you a sort of rhetorical but not silly question. And
okay. Can we wrap it up?
Yeah. All right. So let me ask you this: what is the racial or gender wage gap at people at Walmart?
Well, when
Zero.
we talk about racial,
Zero.
Wait. Okay, hold on, because you're asking me about this, and I'm saying yes. There's like of the people at Walmart are paid less. There is also that women at Walmart are actually paid 67% of what men, and there is a class action lawsuit. There was a class action lawsuit, 1.5 million
all this
women.
Talk about raising, the lowest amongst us, and
there is, but there was historically, it is documented, a gender wage gap at Walmart. Okay, so that is one. So I'm saying. You said no, but I actually researched a whole documentary about Walmart, and I'm telling you that
what's the wage gap at minimum wage? What's the wage gap at minimum wage?
There are all kinds of ways that the wage gap at minimum wage is actually maintained. So yes, there are men and there are white men who are at minimum wage. But what I'm talking about, when we talk about systemic stuff, we talk about things at a big level, so that the people who are and you know what? The people that you see making minimum wage at Walmart, you will see them on the ground more often have solidarity with the people that they work with, the black and brown people that they work with, than with some alt-right person or whatever. Not always, because every situation is different. Every people are different. Okay? We're not talking, see, when you want to talk about fractionalization and then you want to hyper-individualize the examples, right? Like, that doesn't also that also doesn't explain why intergenerational mobility among people of color versus white people is something like I don't have the statistic in front of me, but it is look-upable. It is something like 13%, right? It does not explain how intergenerational transfers of wealth, right, are much higher for white folks than other folks. It doesn't mean that there is some kind of, thing between one particular person and one particular other person, right? What I am talking about is a system. Let's talk about representation, right? How many Asian sitcoms have there been? And this is material, because I used to try to work as an actor once, okay? I try to make a living as a working actor as an Asian woman, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I'm a fan of Margaret Cho and Eddie. I got a book by Eddie Wang, and on my bookshelf right here.
We've had, right? So then when I go into Well, I used to go to auditions, right? I used to go to auditions for TV shows, for stage plays, for all kinds of stuff. And they would do what they call typing out. So they go in and they're looking for who they look for, right? They want the look first before you even get to show them, your acting ability or your singing ability or your dancing ability. They will pick you out by sight.
Mm-hmm.
You know how many of those auditions I went to got typed out of before I got tired of it? And I realized I could not make a living doing the thing that I was trained for over 10 years to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because, my professors my professors when I was coming up, when I was taking acting classes, I was part of the class, so they had to include me. And some people, and I got the leads in plays. But once I got out of school and into the real world, there was no way that I could actually make a living as a working actor. It's only been until, I think the only person that I think really looks like me that I have seen on television is Mindy Kaling and the woman on Superstore. Right?
Acting's really hard. It's hard to make whatever your skin color is like. It's just it's really hard to make.
But this is one.
So.
But this is exact. So this is a very
what about
real material way in which a weight.
What about discrimination against fat actors? What about discriminating against?
That's right.
Against short actors. I got 2
of them. Asian, short, ain't fat. All right, so I got 3 of them. All right. See.
So now you're the one playing your Russian Olympics.
No. But what I'm saying is that I was just joking about that. But all it says in the realm of acting and in representation in popular culture, that does make a difference. Because I never saw anybody who looked like me on TV. I never saw anybody who I didn't even get the So but I'm saying my experience is not better or worse than somebody else because I had some opportunities where other people didn't. But it doesn't change the fact that opportunities exist. There is a thing. It's like if you just look at the resume of a white-sounding name and a black-sounding name, they're 8 times more likely to get a call back if they have the white-sounding name.
So right? here's the thing, all these studies, quote unquote, about racial discrimination. We just don't know how valid they are. I mean, there's so many things wrong with just putting that out there and laying it out as fact because it's not. And it's a study, perhaps. I promoted this. I floated about a study that police officers are actually less likely to fatally wound with a bullet. Black people, coming from Harvard, and Noah went wild on me. Also seconded by a Washington University study. But yeah, that's what they say. But that's the problem with studies, and I have this saying, what's the best map of the city? And the answer is like, is it an atlas? Is it Google? Is it what is it? I don't know. And the answer is the best map of the city is the city itself. And I know that sounds really meta, but you can't model everything. You can't model everything, and they know that.
You're absolutely right that you can't model everything.
And so,
yes, absolutely.
And so, the good thing about your experience, I would say, Mel, is that life isn't fair, and work is definitely not fair. I've met it myself. But the good thing about this country.
But see what's happening.
The good thing about this country, though, is you can do something else. You get another shot. Okay, I didn't get to be an actor, but now I can go to college and get a PhD in geography, and make myself something more than I was. I can transcend that suffering and that disappointment, and be proud of myself. Right? I hope you are. You should be. A PhD is a tremendous achievement, and And so, that's work, and all credit to you, and we all get rejected, and we all get discriminated against. And, so yeah, we have to decide, what are the priorities here? Is it this endless oppression Olympics, or is it helping out these people at minimum wage? Because there are God knows what kind of.
So you're saying it's versus.
What? I'm saying what?
Oh no, go ahead. Finish your point. I'm writing down some notes for the finish.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things about societies, and I think generally speaking, you and I want a little more, well, not equal outcomes, but well, I think we want equal opportunities, but we do want the outcomes to be equal sometime in the future, right? And you can imagine that. And you look at a country like Finland, which has, well, first of all, a very
not dying is a good opportunity.
Yeah, tell me about it, because
Right.
You look at a country like Finland, who has a very high standard of living. They actually have laws such as boards of directors of corporations employing 200 or more people must have 60%, up to 60% women, but no less than 40. And the same is true for men. So you can't have more than 60% men, but you can't have less than 40% men, right? And so, like, how do you get to that? It's like, wow, that's so far off in the future for us. And I think some of us would hear that and say, oh, we got to do that now. And that's exactly what happened within the Green Party, over the past couple of weeks. And so we kind of rushed in and said, equal outcomes to now. And, that's just not the way.
I that because I think you are confused about what happened there, but we don't have time to get into it. But let's spike right that. I'm available to answer any questions because I was there that night with the Black Caucus and the Indigenous Caucus.
All right. So I'll just get to my more general point where
let's get to the
Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. And since civilization began, 20% of the people controlled 80% of the wealth, right? That's just the way it goes. Whatever you have, Marxism, capitalism, non-aligned movement, or whatever, communism, etc. And
are you talking the 20th century or from the beginning of time? Those are two completely different. Those are very, very different temporalities.
I think I'd have to look it up again, but I think it goes back as far as you can remember. And so, what do you do about that? I mean, do you want that, or is that something you can live with? And there's also this other concept of absolute poverty versus relative poverty. And I suggest that here in the United States, what we're dealing with is relative poverty, because you look at charts like life expectancy versus income, and over here, you see life expectancy is really low until you get to about $10,000, and that's about Costa Rica at 80 years of life. And then you keep going across till you get to the United States, and it's 80 years old still, but the income's $40,000. So in between, wherever you live in the world, if you can get at least $10,000 a year to live on in the country that you are, not $10,000 here in the United States, but the least amount, survival, roof over your head, food, water, clothes, $10,000 in Costa Rica, and you're not starving. And so you got to eradicate that, right? Because once you get below $10,000, the life expectancy diminishes rapidly, right? So fix that. And then there's this other thing called relative poverty. And relative poverty basically is income inequality. And income inequality, this distribution of wealth after that, is in essence what I feel that we, both you and I, everyone, is trying to address. And so you see countries that are good in relative poverty above the threshold for survival and expected life expectancy is countries like Japan and Scandinavian countries, Finland again. These countries do well, and countries that do bad, Portugal, Singapore, the United States, and so there, and then you go on to what's crime. Study crime. Crime doesn't occur in uniformly low-income areas. Crime doesn't happen in rich areas. Crime happens at the intersection of wealthy neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. That's when you have crime. And again, it's that idea of relative poverty. I drive whatever it is, a 1998, Honda Accord, and my neighbor, he drives, a Porsche 911, and then you get resentful, and then that's when the trouble starts. And so, I mean, it's been a very long conversation about a lot of things, and what I have always been about is not redistribution or repatriation or any of that. It's addressing these fundamental issues of relative poverty, and it's a restatement of income inequality, and how to do that. What is it? Progressive taxes? I don't know. And then I don't know. That's how you make things a little bit better in this country, right? If you can just
absolutely. I think you've got the motivations I do. We both want to make people's lives better. That is our common ground, right? We can disagree about a lot of stuff, but I think that we both are compassionate people and we want to care about people. But that's also where I want to put this caveat down, is that I don't want to. I mean, we've been going over a lot of things, and you do go into like stuff that's a little bit, like you go into history and stuff, and now like with crime and everything, it's like, what's crime, right? Crime is something that is lived. It's not simply statistics or these formulas like you just said a few minutes ago. We can't model these things. Right? We have to take the lived experience of these folks, right? And so when we talk about taking on oppression as a system, we have to understand that the system, when we understand how the system is oppressive, that's when, we're able to imagine alternatives that are able to help us get beyond, right, whether it's a priority, race, or class. Right? Because when we raise that floor, when we say the basis of my human solidarity is by honoring and valorizing and taking into the account the lived experiences of victims of crime, of perpetrators of crime maybe, right? Poverty crimes, right? Things like, people who break into stuff to be like, because they don't have health care, We want that kind of equal opportunity. Like you said, everybody wants to live and have an equal opportunity. Well, everybody wants to live. That's also a big thing. And so when I think about who do I have solidarity with, it's like I believe in this because I understand that the system is designed to keep people out. It means we have to expand our systems to make sure no one gets left behind in this struggle. The priorities are all together. race and class and gender and identity and, sexual orientation, all of it. When we hold that together and say we do not sacrifice one for the other, that's when we can actually expand our minds to be able to really get to what I think we both want, which is a system that makes everyone's life better. And so I'll end with that, because it's just it's a different way of approaching how we look at this very urgent problem right now.
All right. Well, yeah. And unfortunately, I think it's ironic, but we talk about things in this country a lot, and I believe that things will be determined by forces beyond our control. And ironically, China may be the country that
it is in our hands. That's what Jill says. Well, it is in our hands.
China may be the country that the superpower of the future that has a great effect on geopolitical affairs, and their strange hybrid form of governance and business as state-owned enterprises, but newly industrialized hybrid capitalism and so forth who knows, it may end up ushering in the utopia by accident. Who knows what's going to happen, right? But and so you got to look at the Chinese century and all that stuff. But so I really do. I thought it was a very long talk, and I think we got a lot of stuff out there. I feel that it was respectful. I hope you feel similarly, and I hope some of we both got a catchphrase or two in there. Mine is gonna be like, what's the wage gap at minimum wage? So what's the gender wage gap?
Mine is raise the floor for it all.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, I hope I hope your people got something out of it, and hopefully it's not your people and my people. Hopefully we can come around some things together. And
well, and really, this isn't what it's about. It's not about me. I mean, this is my memo that I put on my cover photo. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's literally about all of us who want to get to this place, right? It is people. It is all of us trying to wrangle with how do we live with each other? How do we work with each other in a way that uplifts us all, right? Instead of one at the expense of another. That's what folks are asking.
Right. Well,
don't get left behind. Here are the people who are getting left behind, asking don't leave us behind.
Yep. Well, at the same time, I'd like to, anyone out there, just stress, keep yourself together and make yourself, I mean, if you're not in true suffering now, be thankful for that and do something with it.
Absolutely.
I mean,
and that's right. I agree.
Right.
I agree.
Great. Well, yeah. I so appreciate all this time. Fun. Yeah. And
well, hopefully this has been educational for folks too.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll talk to you later, Mel.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah.
Enjoy your night.
Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.